Welcome back to Just Liberty, where justice and liberty meet. I'm Bettina Krause, editor of Liberty Magazine, which is the oldest continuously published journal on religious freedom in the world today. I'm here with my co-host, Alan Reinach, who is president and general counsel of the Church State Council, and he has been litigating religious freedom cases for decades. And together, we're trying to take back religious liberty from the political extremes. And talking about political extremes, the debate over church and state in America today, it's always been right there in the background, bubbling away. But today it is heating up like never before. We have some saying religion-state separation, it's hostile toward faith. Others see it, and I see it, as the only way to make sure that all beliefs and non-belief also are accommodated, they have room to exist in America today. And so that's the topic we're digging into, Alan, with our guest, looking at the legal and social issues that are swirling around this and trying to get a sense of where this church-state debate may be headed in the future. And Alan, why don't you go ahead and get us started by introducing our guest?
Our guest today, Rob Boston, is somebody that I've known for really my entire career since law school. Rob has served most recently as senior advisor to Americans United for Separation of Church and State, but has had a long, distinguished career in journalism and communications, editing the magazine Church and State, and a witness to an entire generation of culture war conflict, of religious liberty conflict, of developments in American church-state relations. So, Rob, it's a delight to welcome you to Just Liberty.
Thank you for having me on, Alan. It's great to be with you.
So, I think I was in law school and attending the Americans United meetings when you and I first met back in the 1980s. And I guess that's about the time you may have started there a few years earlier.
That's right. I began working at Americans United in November of 1987. So I think your memory there is just about right.
So that's okay. So that's the year I graduated law school, was 87. So those were interesting times. I mean, that was, the heyday of the moral majority and the Christian coalition. What was it like, at that point to be thrust into the, sort of the forefront of the battle over the separation of church and state?
Well, you're exactly right that it was a period of transition. And these were the closing years of the Reagan administration. And that was an administration that was never particularly favorable to the separation of church and state. Let's put it that way. And of course, we saw that then transition into the administration of the first Bush. So a lot was changing back then. And I think one of the focal points for the change was the U.S. Supreme Court. We may not have realized it at the time, but the court was gradually becoming more favorable to the ideas of Christian nationalist organizations and their interpretation of separation of church and state, a process that we've seen come to fruition more recently. But I think that was the first seeds of that back then in the late 80s.
What you're describing here, this sort of trajectory that the Supreme Court has been on for quite a few years now. We were talking with an academic, Steve Green. I'm sure you know Steve out at Willamette.
Former counsel to Americans United back in the day.
Yes, that's
I know
right.
Steve very well.
He is too. Right, and he talks about the current court's lopsided approach to the religion clauses. So, for those of us, I'm of a different era to you too. I came to the scene in the late 1990s, early 2000s. But even then, the Supreme Court held to a certain interpretation of the Establishment Clause that was more robust in terms of its articulation of Establishment Clause restrictions. So why don't you take us through that sort of arc, that journey we've been on?
Yes, absolutely. Well, I'm not a lawyer, but I have observed this over the years. I've worked closely with the lawyers at Americans United. And one of the things that has most alarmed me has been the incredible shrinkage of the Establishment Clause. And for folks out there listening to us who may not be legal scholars, the Establishment Clause simply means that part of the First Amendment that says that Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion. And there was a time when the Supreme Court very robustly interpreted that clause. If you go back and think about the 1947 Everson decision, the court speaking unanimously of the need for a high wall of separation between church and state, quoting Jefferson's favorite metaphor in a very favorable way. And now we've simply seen that over the years just steadily erode to the point where I think it would be very difficult to muster more than maybe 3 votes on the Supreme Court to endorse Jefferson's metaphor. And that's a shame. The First Amendment's religion clauses consist of 2 parts, as we know, the Establishment and Free Exercise Clause. And I think they ought to both be of equal weight. Unfortunately, we have a situation right now where the Supreme Court has expanded the Free Exercise Clause to this just enormous, blob-like thing that just keeps growing, while steadily shrinking the Establishment Clause to the point where, maybe we can't have an official church. Maybe. Some days I think there are some justices who might find a way to justify that even.
Interesting. Well, I guess, my concept is not so much equal weight as that they both serve the same value, that they need to be read in harmony, not in conflict, to protect religious freedom. Because when we make religion the business of government, that's just, opening Pandora's box to all sorts of mischief. I mean, to put it in a way that I think most of our listeners can relate to, do you really want to trust the government with religion?
I think you raise a very important point there, especially when you talk about the idea of those 2 clauses working together to protect our rights. I think that absolutely was the idea. You have to remember the historical experience of the framers was European. I mean, they knew of the many centuries of religious violence, war, bloodshed, torture, all coming out of the idea that governments took it upon themselves to endorse a certain version of Christianity in Europe and persecute anybody who didn't follow that particular persuasion. And the framers, I think, were very deliberately saying that we were not going to repeat those mistakes here in the United States. In fact, we would have an entirely different system, a separation of religion and government. And that wasn't to suppress religion or to keep it down or to discriminate against it. It was, as you note, to lift it up. To me, one of the great things about the separation of church and state is how it requires all religious organizations to stand on their own 2 feet, to find their own sources of funding, to find their own support. You can't turn to the government and ask for a bailout if you run into trouble. That system has given us an incredible vibrancy and religious diversity in America that it really is a rival of many nations around the globe. And to see the Supreme Court turn its back on that, it's just beyond discouraging.
It's fascinating that you raise that point, because Liberty Magazine has run a couple of articles in recent years from researchers who do these sort of studies of nations around the world where religion is preferred in certain, contexts. And they make a direct correlation between religion that is healthy and vibrant being in places where religion is not supported by the state, but where one religion is preferred by the state, often those religions become less healthy. And this is borne out in data. So, I mean, that's a fascinating idea, that to try to undermine the Establishment Clause, we could be actually shooting ourselves in the foot if we want a vibrant religious environment. You raised the question or the issue of our founding and the intentions of the founders. I think more than any other time in my recent memory, that founding story narrative is disputed. Can you talk about some of the myths that have been circulating around what happened there at our founding and what was created? What sort of nation was created?
Of course, the primary myth that we deal with is the kind of uber myth of all these myths is the claim that the United States was founded to be an officially Christian nation. And this myth has such persistence and surprises me because it's easily debunked simply by looking at the text of the Constitution itself. Our governing document not only does not say anything about we're founded as a Christian nation. In fact, the word Christianity, Christian, God, Jesus, none of those words appear in the Constitution. Not only does it not say that, but it contains a First Amendment, which cuts against the very idea of anything like an established church. And I should add, language at the end of Article 6, which states there shall be no religious test for public office. So obviously, if our founders were interested in the idea of there being no religious test, we could not be an officially Christian nation, and it cuts against our First Amendment as well. But that is a myth that is stubbornly clung to by many in Christian nationalism, and it simply will not die.
So I want to go in a different direction, Rob. Over the past, 4 decades or so that you have been active and serving in this battle to preserve religious freedom, what do you see as maybe the top 1 or 2 or even 3 most significant developments or changes that have taken place?
That's a good question. And I would say for number 1, there was a dramatic change in the question of government funding of religious institutions during the period that I've been with Americans United. When I started in 1987, obviously the idea of private school vouchers and other forms of aid to private religious education was politically very active, and there were various proposals out there. But the Supreme Court still was skeptical of that type of aid. Of course, as we know, in the year 2002, the Supreme Court upheld a voucher plan from Ohio. And as a result, the floodgates really opened up there. And now not only do we have voucher plans funding private religious education in many states, but now we even have it at the federal level, thanks to the so-called Big Beautiful Bill. So there's a sea change there from a court that didn't think that was a very good idea, firmly convinced that violated the First Amendment, to a court now saying that in some cases, not only are states allowed to have voucher plans, but they may even be required to include religious education among them. So big change there. Second area that I would say we've seen a huge shift is the question of what exactly is religious freedom. There was a time when the Supreme Court would look at a question like that and said, well, obviously, the right to attend the house of worship as you choose or not, the right to pray with like-minded religious believers, engage in other types of religious activities. All of these things should be protected. No government attempts to suppress faith or anything like that. But now they've greatly expanded religious freedom to the point where I think it's starting to be used as a bit of a weapon and to take away the rights of other individuals. We may even see the court embrace the idea of blessing religious discrimination in public accommodations, which would be a very serious change. So those are just 2 areas where we've seen it. There are others, but those are the 2 main ones that I would point to.
The example of funding, state funding that you just referred to, I guess the next big hurdle for those who are pushing for expanded state funding for religious enterprises is the issue of charter schools. I mean, we saw the Supreme Court failed to overturn a state Supreme Court decision which said, no, Oklahoma cannot create a wholly state-funded religious charter school. I don't know if you have seen recently, Ellen, I don't know if you've seen it either, but there's an Orthodox Jewish organization in Oklahoma that is now attempting to go the same route to create a wholly state-funded religious charter school. So this issue is not going away, right? We're only at the foothills of this issue, right?
Well, it really is quite remarkable that we are talking about the idea of a religious public school. I mean, let's remember here, charter schools are public institutions. They're not private voucher-run schools. They're public schools. They're part of that system. And for a long time, the understanding was that while charter schools would be free from some of the traditional regulations that are imposed on public schools, they would not be religious in nature. The idea of a religious public school to me is an oxymoron. Yet, as you note, there have been efforts to create such institutions, first with an online school called St. Isidore in Oklahoma. The Supreme Court deadlocked on that because it was a 4-4 vote. And now there's an effort to revive that, ironically, with a Jewish school in Oklahoma. So Americans United has been following that very closely. And obviously, we're arguing that there cannot be such a thing as religious public schools. The idea of public schools is that they're open to all students of all faiths and none, and this cuts against that.
You know, I got to chime in here with a be careful what you wish for kind of thing. You know, years ago, Rob, I had a long discussion with the leader of the voucher movement in Texas. And being as how my ministry was in California, at the end of the discussion, you know, I made the observation that maybe in Texas, you can get government funds and not have, you know, strangling government regulations that really put a lid on what you teach and how you hire and how you conduct your school. But in California, we know better, right? We know that with the government funds, a secular state is going to put the kibosh on the freedom of a religious school. So in the be careful what you wish for department, you know, the more that this expands funding nationally, well, what happens when the backlash comes? Right? You know, we assume that we're going to have friendly governments letting us do whatever we want, teach whatever we want, hire whatever we want, conduct our schools the way we want. But inevitably, you know, we're going to find that noose around our necks, and we're going to be in a really tough position because, you know, it's the old golden rule, right? The one that's not in the Bible. You know, he who's got the gold makes the rules. I've been preaching that for as long as you've been in Americans United.
Well, I think you're making a very good point there. We happen to be in a political climate right now that is not so favorable to regulation. So I think some of these folks in private religious education are thinking, great, I'm going to get all this taxpayer money and I'm not going to get any additional regulations imposed upon me. Well, that may be the political climate right now. That probably won't be the political climate in 10 years or 20 years or 30 years. Inevitably, Alan, I think you know this, everybody should know this, what the state funds, it also regulates. And that will happen sooner or later. It'll either happen through the political process or through organizations bringing legal challenges because, let's say, for example, you get fired from a religious school because they decide they don't like your lifestyle, or your kid can't get into the school. We're already seeing cases like that. The private religious schools have been winning them so far, but I wouldn't assume that will always be the case.
You know, one of the persistent problems that I face at Liberty Magazine is trying to justify the idea of church-state, religion-state separation as something that is fundamentally in favor of religion, pro-religion, because there is a narrative that's really hard to argue against, to shake at the moment, that says if you are standing for strong Establishment Clause restrictions, then you must be hostile toward religion. I mean, the church, the religion that I work for, the Seventh-day Adventist Church, we're an anomaly today because we're a conservative religious community, but we also stand for strong church-state separation. And that's just a really uncomfortable place to be these days. I'm wondering, from your perspective, your history with this issue, how can we make church-state separation more attractive to your average Christian?
I think we need to get back to basics. And we need to remind people that the idea of church-state separation, as conceived by our founders, was not to suppress religion or to keep it down, just the opposite. And also remind people that church-state separation is an American original. It's a traditional principle that we pioneered, we founded it, we should be proud of it. I think the problem that we've had over the years is that separation of church and state, sometimes its most visible application, has been in areas that some people do feel uncomfortable with, like the kind of fights we have about Christmas decorations at City Hall every year. And that sometimes people have gotten the wrong idea that the principle of separation of church and state is trying to silence a religious voice, when in reality, all it's saying is that we don't want the government speaking in a religious way. So we maybe could have done a better argument over the years in reminding people that the separation of church and state allows for private religious expression to a really broad degree, while it does curtail what the government can do in the religious sphere. And Alan has remarked about the issue of, do you really want the government speaking in a religious voice? Do you really want the government deciding it's going to help religion? Because when it does that, it usually doesn't help. And conservatives ought to be the first ones to acknowledge that. I mean, they're the ones that always preach limited government. Well, if we want limited government, why would we not want that in our religious lives as well?
Exhibit A to me, Rob, and I've been talking about this forever, it seems, goes back to the old Regent's Prayer case out of New York, where the Supreme Court allegedly kicked God and prayer out of public schools. And, the Board of Regents, which I have always imagined as the classic kind of cigar smoking backroom, sort of situation. I know that's a caricature, but I just imagine, these old guys smoking their cigars, writing this prayer that the kids are going to recite the same prayer day in and day out. Now, aside from the fact that the prayer itself was kind of, lowest common denominator, it wasn't, very deep theologically or any other way. But, it reminds me of the teachings of Jesus himself, who said, that not to beware of vain repetition, right? That our prayers are not to be just, rote repetition of the same phrases over and over again. But, in the words of one of my favorite authors, that prayer is the opening of the heart to God as to a friend. And clearly, when you're telling the kids to say the same words over and over again, day in and day out, that's an example of government teaching kids the wrong thing about what prayer is. And it's just typical of what happens when you get government, meddling in the business of religion. Why we want to do religion ourselves, in our families, in our churches, right? And leave government out of it.
Yeah, absolutely. The idea of a prayer drafted by bureaucrats should be alarming to just about everybody. That's not their job. We have religious leaders whose job it is to call us to faith if we choose to be involved in that sort of thing. One of the things I've always reminded folks about over the years when it comes to prayer in schools is, first of all, it's perfectly legal. It's perfectly allowed. Students can pray during their private time. They can read the Bible or other religious books if they happen to have free time. It's only the state-sponsored, the state-compelled, the state-mandated prayer that the court struck down. And also, I would remind people, if we were to move away from that, the court were to overturn those decisions, you have to think about what types of prayers would be recited in the incredibly pluralistic and diverse nation we have become. And I think a lot of people make the mistake of assuming that the prayers are always going to be something they're comfortable with. But it might not be if it's a Wiccan leading the prayer, or if it's a Buddhist or a Muslim or a Hindu, or even a liberal Christian. A prayer by a liberal Christian might offend a lot of conservative Christians. So aside from just the legal argument, one of the things we need to keep in mind here is that given the great diversity of this nation right now, which is still growing and expanding in amazing ways, there is no such thing as a one-size-fits-all prayer. It's absurd.
We're getting toward the end of our time, but I wanted to just raise another issue which we at Liberty Magazine are focusing on, and that is the precarious state of the Johnson Amendment and what that perhaps portends for the role of churches in our political life as a country. Do you have any perspective on that?
Absolutely. Americans United has defended the Johnson Amendment, which prohibits houses of worship from intervening in partisan politics by endorsing or opposing candidates. It doesn't prevent them from speaking out on issues, but it simply says they cannot endorse or oppose candidates. And it's not just houses of worship, it's any 501c3 nonprofit organization. And we have defended that at Americans United for decades, holding that is an important thing for both religion and government, not to have our churches turned into partisan political units. Well, that provision, which is found in federal law, dates back to 1954, has been under attack, and efforts by the Trump administration to virtually wipe it off the books are ongoing. I would just remind people that the purpose of a house of worship is not partisan political. And all the polling data shows that Americans are very concerned about churches getting drawn into political machines. So the public support is there, but unfortunately we're at a period where politically this attack on that amendment is ongoing, and we're just not sure where we're going to end up.
So, Rob, this has been going on for some time, and years ago, we were aware that there was no denominational support for attacking the Johnson Amendment. None of the Christian denominations were calling for the repeal of the Johnson Amendment. Is that still the case today? Or are there any denominations as such that have, jumped on the bandwagon of wanting to be permitted to be more partisan?
It's interesting that the denominational support, I think, is still pretty strong in favor of maintaining the Johnson Amendment. Where you're getting the dissent tends to come primarily from Christian nationalist organizations and a small number of religious leaders who say that they would like to be able to get involved in partisan politics, and some who have openly violated the law over the years by endorsing or opposing candidates from the pulpit. But I think those folks are outliers. Most of the American religious community and most of the American religious leaders just don't think dragging partisan politics into the pulpit is a good idea.
Okay, so as we finish up, Rob, looking back over your career, looking forward to perhaps what the future holds, optimistic or pessimistic?
Well, this may seem strange considering the situation we're in right now, where things are so alarming, but I am optimistic for the future, and for a couple of reasons. One is that at Americans United and at other organizations, we are raising up new generations of young leaders who I think are really going to carry this fight forward. And if they can use any of the work that I've done over the years, I'm happy for that. But the larger reason I'm optimistic is that I think that the America that the Supreme Court is trying to foist upon this nation is an America that simply does not work for us. Our religious diversity is expanding in incredibly exciting ways. With people, you hear a lot about people stepping away from organized religion. Well, that may be happening, but it doesn't mean that they're abandoning their faith. They're just having a do-it-yourself religion, or they're borrowing from many different traditions, or they're a blended family. So the interest in spiritual things is there. So the sort of Christian nationalist straitjacket that the Supreme Court is trying to put on this nation is not going to fit for us in the future, and we will break free. Now, this is going to take some time. I hope I live long enough to see the reestablishment of separation of church and state as the founders intended. I might not, but I do know that it will happen in the future simply because it must happen.
Well, thank you so much for sharing your time with us today. We appreciate your insights, and all the best in whatever the next chapter of your life brings.
Thank you so much for having me on.
Thinking, Bettina, about the priorities or the highlights that Rob Boston discussed, clearly that is a reflection of their organization. But it strikes me that they left out something that's rather significant in terms of the broader picture of Christian nationalism. You know, I have said for a very long time that the number one religious liberty issue in America today is not crosses on hills or commandment posters in public schools, etc. It's, the Americans losing their jobs every single business day, right? But and I stick by that. But in terms of Christian nationalism, the kind of accoutrements of civil religion, the commandments in the schools, the chaplains in the schools, the whole issue of the battle over education, curriculum, etc. I think these are enormously significant church state issues.
Well, I think they are as well, Alan, but I think you're right that if we focus only on those things, we don't get a complete picture or understanding of what religious liberty challenges exist today. And I'm tempted to say that folks who come at church state separation from a very strict, very sort of I'm trying to find the word to describe it, but who are taking a very strident approach to church state separation sometimes forget that in some instances, faith does need to be protected in the public space.
Sure.
And a person's ability to express their faith in the public space needs to be protected, whether that is in a workplace environment, whether that is in bringing their faith values into their civic participation. I think people get hung up on the idea of church-state separation as sort of hard, hostile. Let's get rid of all religion, even any mention of religion in the public life of our country. That's not the type of separation that we're talking about, right?
No, it certainly isn't. But I think, where Rob got caught in the weeds and missed the kind of broader perspective is, why is it that public schools have been the focus of so much of the battle over both with respect to what happens in the public schools and the funding of religious alternatives, right? This is where, an enormous percentage of the energy and the money and the battle is fought over the idea that the public school is a place for everybody. That Jewish kids or Muslim kids don't go to public school to feel badly because their family doesn't celebrate Christmas, right?
Right.
But that happens to so many kids. And, public school is where we figure out, how do we be a nation with so many different types of people and beliefs and families, where we have, going back to the Civil War and the 14th Amendment, equal protection for everybody. The law treats everybody equally. It's a concept that the Republican Party in the North at the time shoved down the throats of the South and required the Southern states to ratify the amendment as a condition of being of reentry into the Republic. But the old saying is a man convinced against his will is of the same opinion still. And we still have this attack on the basic concepts of equality. We haven't fully embraced that as a nation, even though it's been part of our Constitution for 160 years?
Yeah. There's another dimension to this as well, though, because that argument, that scenario that you've painted may well have been the case maybe a decade ago, 15 years ago. But today, I think many religious people are saying we're the ones who are not being treated equally in the public school system because the interpretation of church-state separation in public schools has yielded an approach to public education that is actively hostile toward religious faith. And so there's kind of been a change in the dynamic in recent years that needs to be figured into this whole discussion. I mean, whether that is meritorious or not, I mean, that's a whole other show. But I think we need to understand how that is shaping people's understanding of things like funding for private religious schools and so on.
Well, there's no question. And we've covered some topics like the Maryland case in the Supreme Court this year, where public schools have been demonstrably hostile to conservative values, Christian values, but they're not just Christian values when it comes to issues of human sexuality and the like. So there's no question that is happening, but it's also let's not be naive. It's being exploited for political purposes, right? And I go back to my analysis of what took place back when the Supreme Court issued its decisions about prayer and Bible reading in the public schools, and the Christian community, by and large, took an extreme position that was hostile to the Supreme Court. They were saying that the Supreme Court kicked prayer out of the public schools. And, the irony here, Bettina, is, number one, public school administrators began to believe them. Okay? And so, if you have, and the other part of that, the flip side of that, was that religion became such a hot potato, such a source of conflict, that public school administrators wanted nothing to do with it, right? And so I put the blame on this pendulum shift, because I say pendulum shift because American public schools were thoroughly Protestant for, generations, until the Supreme Court said, well, no, that's not appropriate, right? But instead of adapting and working for a balanced approach that respects religion and incorporates religion appropriately into the curriculum, it became just a political tool of the culture war. So, here we are. And separation of church and state has been a victim of an unfortunate culture war conflict. So that's my story, and I'm sticking to it.
and well, you should, Alan. But I think Rob's broader point, which was that the religion clauses in the Constitution, their interpretation has become profoundly unbalanced. I think that point, for me, was the most significant one that he made in our conversation, because I don't think people understand just how serious that imbalance is and what it potentially portends down the line. Because unless those clauses are working together in tandem, then they're not functioning as they should. And we're going to see the fallout from that in years to come.
Well, we certainly are going to need to do some more programming talking about just what the Supreme Court has been doing. I'll just offer a teaser and say, I'm far less concerned about aggressively protecting the free exercise of religion than I am about diminishing the protections of the Establishment Clause. I'd like to see both clauses vigorously protected.
Alan, I'm 100% in agreement with you, which is a good thing to end this podcast on. So thank you, everyone, for joining us for this episode of Just Liberty. Until next time, remember, the price of liberty is eternal vigilance.
Amen to that.